We heard in the reading today that Joshua leads the people into the Promised Land for celebrating the Passover, and the manna ceases. That's obviously the conclusion of the Exodus. The fulfillment of the Exodus is reaching the Promised Land. It's interesting to note, and you'll see this in the bulletin, that the name that we render in English, Jesus, or of course in Spanish, Jesus, is the same in Hebrew as we render Joshua. Both perfectly legitimate because of the way language works. But Joshua leads the people into the Promised Land on earth, and Jesus leads us into the Promised Land in heaven. So the goal, again, is to follow the new Moses and then the new Joshua into the Holy Land. But we're still considering during Lent the fact that we have to leave Egypt first. Last week we talked about that, the need to repent and to actually to escape, with the grace of God, the slavery of sin. And that is to Pharaoh, it was a symbol of Satan. This week I want to speak a little bit more particularly about the leaving of Egypt part, the practical side. If you think about the Exodus, and again I hope you are reading the Exodus, I hope that children are reading the Exodus to remind themselves of the basic of the story, that in the Exodus, the Exodus begins after the last of the 10 plagues. And each of these plagues is in some way a strike against the gods of Egypt. What I mean by that is, for example, you have the supposed god Hapi, who is the god of the Nile inundation, right? So by turning the Nile into blood, it's a conquering of that god, so to speak. The goddess Heket is depicted as a frog, so there's that plague as well, etc., etc. So all of these plagues are somehow connected to the idolatry of the Egyptians and conquering that idolatry. So it's a reminder to us that in order to leave Egypt, to leave that slavery of sin, we also need to address our idols. Now, what are our idols? Catholics, well, real Catholics I should say, practicing Catholics, don't have idols. And I don't care what the Protestants say, these are not idols because we're not actually worshiping them, right? So that's a different story. But we don't have real idols either, where we have statues in our homes that we think are our gods, and that is where our benefits come from, and they rule the universe. No, we don't have those, okay? Again, you can't really be a Christian and worship anything other than the true God. But it is very possible to fall into idolatry as a Christian. Not generally, but in particular instances. What I mean is, whoever or whatever you miss Mass for, whoever or whatever you perform unnecessary servile work on Sunday for, whoever or whatever you omit your prayers for, or disrespect your parents and lawful authority for, or hurt others physically, emotionally, or spiritually for, or commit sins of impurity with or against, or steal for, and lie for, is an idol. We make an idol anyone or anything that we are willing to sin for. Anything we choose over charity is an idol. And because we always choose ourselves over God when we sin, sin is always a form of self-worship. So that is something that we need to consider in our reflections on our relationship with God and on our journey of this Exodus. Now, I want to say, though, that there is another way to look at idols, which is just as true, but maybe a bit more practical for many of us, because if you're coming here, you probably at least recognize the fact that we should love God above all things. And there are sometimes things we put above God. But there's a more subtle area to look at. And this has to do with the relationship between the 7 capital sins and our wounds, and then the idolatry that we commit because of them. So Dr. Bob Schutz is the one who lays this out. And in my pastoral experience, in the confessional and talking with people, etc., I find this to be absolutely So, for example, when we suffer from the wound of shame, we fall into the capital sin of pride, making an idol out of ourselves and our accomplishments. There's also a wound of lack of affirmation here, which ties in. When we suffer from a lack of a sense of worthiness, we fall into envy, making an idol out of status, possessions, talents, etc. Because we don't feel that we have that worth. When we suffer from abandonment, it doesn't have to be very grave, it can be little things. It could probably just be being left by your parents in a grocery store for 5 minutes. But whatever the abandonment is, we fall into gluttony, making an idol of food and drink. Dr. Schutz mentions drugs here as well, meaning pharmaceutical kind of drugs. Not technically the sin of gluttony, but since it fits the same dynamic of medicating yourself to feel better, it does work. Many people, when they ask, I just don't know why I can't stop eating, it's because they haven't addressed this wound of abandonment. And because it's not an obvious connection, they miss it. When we suffer from rejection or not feeling desirable, we fall into the sin of lust and making an idol out of sex, relationships, and beauty. I believe this is one of the reasons why the sixth commandment, breaking thereof, is so rampant, and why so many people who are faithfully trying to follow Christ fall into these habitual sins of lust is mainly because of the wound, not because they are malicious or are refusing to follow God's law. When we suffer from powerlessness and fear, we fall into wrath. That's the proper term for anger, sinful anger, I should say. Making an idol out of power, control, and justice. This is a huge one. When you have, for example, children acting out, many parents just think, well, if you just beat them, that will solve the problem. No. You need to find out, why is your child angry all the time? Right? There's something else going on there that you need to find out and discern. I have that a lot. We also see this control issue a lot with adults, that since they lack this sense of security, they take it out on others by trying to control them. When we suffer from insecurity and lack of self-worth, we fall into greed, making an idol out of wealth and other forms of security. And when we suffer from feeling incapable of meeting others' expectations, listen carefully, this is a huge one. When we suffer from feeling incapable of meeting others' expectations, we fall into sloth, making an idol out of comfort and ease. This is another very common dynamic. And again, I see it young and old. If someone can't seem to get the energy to do things, it's very often the fact that they have a parent or a spouse or a boss or someone who is unreasonable in their expectations, and so to respond to that, instead of being frustrated with not being able to do everything, they simply shut down. I want to emphasize something which I don't have here in my notes, but it's really important to remember that although some of these we're talking about feelings here, remember that the feeling itself is never the sin. It's only how we respond to it. So feeling rejected or undesirable is not a sin. The lust that we voluntarily commit, that's the sin, right? These aren't excuses for committing sin, but it's to help us understand them and to not feel guilty for the feelings themselves, but to try to understand them and discern them. Whenever we suffer from any of these capital sins, especially if we fought against them for a long time without success, then we really need to consider this emotional dynamic. Now, in one sense, it doesn't matter what our idols are or why we worship them. Anything that we place before God is an idol, and it must be removed. And I say this, of course, by God's grace. Force of will is never going to succeed in this only. You have to have God's grace to do it. It requires discernment, and especially for those who are sitting here thinking, that's good. Good stuff, Father, but I don't have any idols. Well, then maybe you're idolizing your own opinion. Okay? The point is that it does require discernment, and we need to understand this because all of us suffer from this. It also requires grace because, again, we may not be purposely doing anything to reject God. We may be consciously doing our best to follow his law, follow his will, to love him, and still falling into sin. When we